When I first got out of high school, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I was always motivated by doing something in regards to combating climate change. So originally it was going to be for engineering with the goal of working in renewables up until I watched this documentary on Netflix. I think it's still there. It's called Kiss the Ground. Apparently it was inspired off of a book over there, but it was really good. It kind of introduced me into regenerative agriculture. And so then I changed my education path and went and got a 2-year degree in horticulture. And since then, I've just been trying to farm organically. And I'm also, my full-time job is a plant healthcare specialist at a company called Save-A-Tree. And eventually, hopefully one day, I'll be able to farm full-time. The name of my farm is North Fourth Farm, and I'm like half mile down the road off of, you guessed it, North 4th Avenue.
I like it. Catchy.
So I just want to talk about like sort of the principles and how organic farmers go about farming organically, and how we don't have to resort to these traditional methods of agriculture like tilling and applying pesticides. And the first principle is biodiversity, which is extremely important. So to take you guys back to biology in high school, this is a very simple food web. And we're going to see what happens when we take out just 2 organisms. We're going to take out this little guy right here. It's an aphid, looks like. And then we're going to take out the caterpillar. And if you guys garden, you probably are familiar with aphids. They do a lot of damage. And then if you've grown tomatoes, maybe you've encountered tomato hornworms, which are these really big, juicy caterpillars that they'll do a number on your tomato plants. So these 2 things can both be considered pests in agriculture. So, maybe a farmer or a gardener will spray for them to try and completely eradicate them. But when we do eradicate them, now the ladybug has nothing to eat. Ladybugs are incredible predators and incredible biological control for aphids, especially in the larval stage. They're referred to aphid lions because they can eat like hundreds of aphids every day. And then this little earwig beetle-looking thing. So the ladybug and the little beetle-looking thing, they don't have anything to eat anymore. So they get eradicated. And now you've got the bird entirely dependent on the grasshopper, which have been really bad this year, by the way. But the bird's also in competition with the mouse, and then the mouse can also eat this little grub thing. But let's say they eat so many of those to where they probably wouldn't completely eradicate them, but like they would decrease their population to the point where now the mouse and the birds, their population is going to be in decline because there's so much competition for those things, because now they're entirely dependent on those 2 organisms. So for the sake of the example, we're going to say those 2 have now been eradicated. And now the mouse and the bird, they don't have anything to eat, so they die. And then the owl doesn't have anything to eat, so it dies. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and destroys the whole food web until we're left with mosquitoes and daisies. And daisies, now there's nothing to pollinate the daisies because there's no insects anymore. And so we're left with mosquitoes. And that's not a future that any of us want.
Because they were bad this summer.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, they weren't bad in our yard this year.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Maybe it's because we had other stuff.
Yeah, you guys have a good ecosystem.
Yeah.
We're actually we're a certified wildlife habitat.
Yeah.
So,
awesome.
yeah,
That's
it's
lovely.
pretty neat.
Yeah, okay.
Just trying. So yeah, biodiversity is important. Especially in the agricultural setting. So if we compare a biodiverse environment to what you traditionally see in agriculture, which is a monoculture, and all a monoculture is one crop or one organism growing in a large plot of land. So we'll see like wheat or soy or corn in this example. And why it's so bad. So if you've got a whole plot of land just growing corn, a monoculture of a crop is an oasis for the pest of whatever that crop is. So in this example, would be a corn rootworm. Imagine yourself as a corn rootworm living in a cornfield. You've got plenty of food. You're gonna thrive. And there's no trees or anything. So there's no habitat for a bird to maybe control that corn rootworm. There's probably not a whole lot of other organisms in the soil to keep them in check. So they thrive. And what does the farmer have to do? The farmer has to apply an insecticide to keep those corn rootworms in control. So yeah, monocultures are bad. Biodiversity is important. And that same concept of biodiversity that we see above the ground, that we can see all around us, the same thing happens in the soil as well. We just don't really think about it because it's in the ground. We don't see it, and then there's like creepy crawlies. But you've got protozoa and fungi and nematodes and a whole bunch of little insects and organisms crawling around in the soil that are just really important for the health of the soil. So all of this is considered the microbial life of the soil. And if you notice at the top of the chart, organic matter, that goes and feeds the rest of these guys. But yeah, microbial life is important because it converts nutrients in organic matter into plant available forms. So you can't just like plant a seed on a stick or a branch from a tree, right? Like you need all the insects, the bacteria, and the fungi to break that stuff down and convert it into a plant available form. So like earthworms, for example, there's a form of composting called vermicomposting, where you have a bin of worms and you toss your veggie scraps in there, and the worms eat those veggie scraps. And my mom said not to use poop in this presentation, but that's what they do. Okay?
But that's it.
Secretion.
Yes, there you go.
They eat, the organic matter, and they secrete it.
Yes.
And after they do that, now it's fertilizer. It's really, vermicompost is like incredible fertilizer for plants. Another thing earthworms do is as they make their way through the soil, they create these capillaries in the soil, which is just like a pocket of air, because plants need access, their roots need access to air to thrive. So surprisingly, more houseplants die from overwatering than they do underwatering. So it's because you're drowning the roots, and they need access to air to flourish. They need a moist environment, but they also need air. And as your earthworm moves itself around in the soil, it's creating those pockets of air, and it's really tilling the soil for you. But yeah, so earthworms.
I love them. I get excited when I see
Me
them.
too.
Yeah.
They're cute.
Pull out of the postman. Yeah.
And then humus binds soil particles together. Humus is just a interesting, I want to say, chain of carbon. I don't know, I'm not a chemist, but it's good for the soil. They bind soil particles together and help with the porosity of the soil. And then the microbial life also reduces the need for synthetic fertilizers, just because they're converting the nutrients in the organic matter into plant available forms. So you don't have to apply as many synthetic fertilizers if you are at all. And then pest suppression, which is, you can just it's just that whole concept of biodiversity happening in the soil. Like going back to the corn rootworm, maybe there's other things in the soil that are going to eat that corn rootworm and help to keep their numbers in check. So microbial life is important, and we want to try and preserve that microbial life. So the second principle would be minimal tillage. So traditionally, farmers will go and till their soil to aerate it, to make it more porous, right? Because we know that the plant's roots need access to air. And then it'll also kind of take some of the nutrients from lower in the soil profile and bring it up higher. And you've temporarily created this environment where you can grow plants in well, but every time you till, it's really disrupting all that microbial life. Like picture a giant coming and picking up the entire city of Brighton and just shaking it up. And then, doing that year after year and expecting all of us to be able to find our way back home and fix everything and get everything settled in. Well, you do that year after year, I mean, people aren't going to be happy. They're going to leave Brighton. They're going to be like, this giant house that shakes our whole town up. And they're not going to want to stick around. So minimal tillage is another principle, and it's a growing movement among organic farmers, just not tilling the soil as well. And a whole other thing, we can sequester carbon out of the air into the soil where it belongs. Like that's the whole thing with climate change, is we've taken all this carbon that's been made into natural gas or gasoline over millions and millions of years, and we're taking that out of the ground and we're burning it and putting it in the air. But carbon sequestration, as you add organic matter to the soil, you're keeping carbon in the soil. Because as plants photosynthesize, right, they're uptaking carbon dioxide and they're creating organic matter. And if you don't till it, you're going to leave it there in the ground. So you sequester carbon.
Circle of life.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
One of those circles, yeah.
But we've disrupted it just by tilling it. And if we till, we bring up a lot of that organic matter and a lot of those carbon caches, and we oxidize them because now we're exposing them to air, and it gets converted back to CO2. So that's another benefit of minimal tillage, is you're sequestering carbon.
Right.
Crop rotation, a lot of this is really just taking care of the soil. You're not, the way I like to look at it is you're not farming plants, you're farming the soil. And in turn, the soil is going to give you whatever you want out of it. You plant a seed in there, it's healthy soil, the plant's going to thrive. So crop rotation, you switch up the plants in a given plot. So if I grow corn one year and a corn rootworm starts to get established in that plot, well, if I switch it up to kale or carrots the following year, that corn rootworm can't eat because it's not a carrot rootworm, it's a corn rootworm. So it helps with pest suppression. The same nutrients aren't being demanded from the crop. So like if I have a row of tomatoes want a lot of phosphorus and potassium. So I take all that phosphorus and potassium out of the soil when I harvest those tomatoes, and then I go back through and I plant lettuce, which is a really light feeder. It wants mostly nitrogen, and that gives sort of the soil a break, and it doesn't have to provide the same amounts of phosphorus and potassium just because I'm planting something else and asking something different from the soil when I do the lettuce. I hope that makes sense.
I can follow.
It does.
Yes.
And constantly changing the environment, reducing weed pressure. Weeds, all a weed is a plant growing somewhere that you don't want it growing. So anything can be considered a weed, right? You could have an apple tree growing in anywhere, like your row of lettuce, and because you don't want apples there, it's considered a weed. But different weeds like different environments, and by switching up the type of plants that you're growing in that environment, you're making it harder for weeds to get established and really cause a problem for you. Crop rotation is important. Keeping the soil covered through cover crops, which is gaining and cover crops are gaining in popularity amongst traditional farmers, even though they're still probably doing monocultures. But by keeping the soil covered, you're constantly feeding the soil as you have something growing in there. The plant is photosynthesizing and secreting the sugars that it's creating out into the soil. So you're feeding the microbial life of the soil just by having a plant growing there. And it also, it doesn't dry out as quickly. You know, the sun's not beating down on the soil, and it doesn't dry out. And the microbial life needs moisture to survive, needs water just like anything else. So, yeah, keeping the soil covered, it's good. There's a quote from a farmer that I really like. He says, if you're not feeding the soil is feeding on itself. So just keep something growing in the soil. And now, I wouldn't be an organic farmer if I didn't show off my soil, because it's something we all take pride in. So going back to how I was talking about humus sort of binding the soil particles together, you can kind of see that there, how it's clumpy, and you can see how porous it is. So the plant's roots are having.
And that was a word.
Yeah, exactly. There's a worm. It's a nice little worm. And if you, I take pride in that. Like, it's so dark and rich in nutrition. And if you ever drive past a traditional farm after they've harvested, and if they're not growing a cover crop, you look at their dirt, and that's what it is.
Yeah, it's completely dried out.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Sad.
Right.
Light
It doesn't
brown.
look healthy. It's compacted, and it's not soil. It's dirt. There's no life to it. So yeah. So not only is organic farming good for the planet, but is it better for you? Does it provide a better product for you?
Were those your vegetables?
Yes.
It's so beautiful. Oh my gosh, yeah. And
He brings those
look
into
at the
work.
pickles.
I know. You
Yeah.
get hot ones?
Yeah, they are.
I used to have a neighbor when we were growing up, and she gardened all the time, and she made these the best hot ones
Oh,
ever. His
yeah.
mom.
Red pepper flakes. You
I don't
think?
know what she
No?
used because I was so young.
Uh-huh.
All I know is I loved it, and I can't find a pickle that
Oh,
tastes
yeah.
like that. You know.
Oh, they look beautiful.
I'll bring you some.
Yeah.
I've been told that like my pickles are a little bit too spicy.
Oh,
So
I
Oh,
eat
she'll
a
love
little
that.
bit. Oh yeah, all right.
She likes the hot.
Good. But so the University of Washington did a study where they compared 8 regenerative / organic farms to a traditional farm, and they had the exact same crop growing on both places. And then they compared the nutrient density of those 2 crops from those 2 different farms. And they did it all across the U.S. There's 10 spots. It's not important. One of them they couldn't secure accurate data because the regenerative farm and the conventional farm, they grew 2 different varieties of the crop, so they kind of skewed their data. And the one in California, it was the same farm, but one plot had been farmed organically for a number of years, and they took cabbage and they compared that with cabbage from a new plot of land that had only recently been converted to organic. And they took the average of the difference in nutrients from the regenerative and the conventional, and they averaged out with the regenerative / organic crops had 34% more vitamin K, 15% more vitamin E, 14% more vitamin B1, and 17% more vitamin B2. So you're already, like your regenerative corn, your organically grown corn, is more dense in nutrients than the conventional corn. Aside from that, the regenerative farms also have 15% more carotenoids, which I know in vegetables gives vegetables their color, and when we eat them, I think it exhibits antioxidant effects in our bodies. I'm not sure. Real
Yes,
fast, for sure.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, great health for your skin, your eyes, the brain, yeah, and immune system. The
Okay.
antioxidants help the free radicals in our system, yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's super beneficial. And if you're getting higher doses of that from a vegetable and a fruit, it's, it's very, very important to our system.
And then phenolics, they compete with free radicals too, I believe.
Yeah, they're a little bit different, but yes,
Okay.
in a base they would be definitely an antioxidant as well.
Sure. And yeah, 22% more phytosterols. So whatever those guys are.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
So phyto being from plant,
Right.
sterols, that our system uses those in communication for shuttling hormones and vitamins in and out of cells. Yeah, sterols are super important. Also immune boosting. Yeah, kind of an offhanded way.
So you take a carrot grown regeneratively or organically, and you compare that to a conventional carrot. Well, it's a more nutrient dense carrot, just being grown organically. Essentially, that's more bang for your buck, right? If you're going to spend money on one carrot, it's a healthier carrot for you. So, in summary, organic farming is better for the environment. It's tremendously better for the environment, better for you because it's more nutrient dense, and it's also not covered in residual amounts of pesticides. So those aren't being built up in your body. And yeah, it's just good. Tastes better too. I've heard lots of people say that produce doesn't taste the same how it used to when they were kids, and maybe that's because of the degradation of our soils. They're not as rich in nutrients anymore, and now traditional farmers are just doing whatever they can to make a yield, throwing down synthetic fertilizers. And that's a whole other point. Would you rather your nutrition be derived from a biological process that's been in place for millions and millions of years, or would you rather it come from a chemical bought from like Russia? Because I think Russia is the main
Russia's
exporter.
trying to kill us all.
Right? Yeah. Some way or the other, right?
I think they're the main supplier of nitrogen-based fertilizers, and so a lot of traditional farmers get their nitrogen fertilizer from Russia. And we can make our own fertilizer by composting organic materials. So you've got U.S.-made fertilizer that's better. Made fertilizer that's better for U.S. soil and better for us in turn. So that's my presentation.
Oh,
If you-
that's very
thank